So, anti-submarine warfare in World War One. Well, this should be a relatively interesting topic. There's been an awful lot written about the anti-submarine campaigns of the Second World War, but not so much about the First, although there is still a wealth of information out there for the discerning reader. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus primarily on the efforts of the Royal Navy in anti-submarine warfare in the First World War, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, well, they were the ones who had to face off against the bulk of the U-boats, and the U-boats were the single largest and most effective submarine force of the First World War, so it should come as a little surprise that the vast majority of anti-submarine warfare technology, tactics, and development came in that particular conflict, hence the focus. And secondly, because of course necessity is the mother of invention, with the Royal Navy and the British Merchant Marine being the primary focus of the largest submarine fleet to be built during the First World War, it comes as no surprise that the vast majority of techniques, technology, etc. that was developed during this period was developed first in that part of the conflict. So, with that said, let's get on with it. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 would bring with it many new technologies that had previously been unseen in conflict in prior wars. One of the most significant, of course, being the submarine. There had been sporadic efforts to use submersible vessels in previous conflicts, going all the way back to the Age of Sail. But this was the first time that entire fleets of sea-going, torpedo-armed craft could be seriously considered to have posed a significant threat to a navy's existence, or at least a navy's combat effectiveness. At the same time, there was actually very little idea about how to actually deal with this threat. This is perhaps unsurprising when you consider that merely 13 years before, the very first proper submarines were only just entering service, and they consisted of absolutely tiny vessels with a minimal armament, and they were essentially capable of harbour defence on a good day, and not a lot else. It wasn't until around 1905-1906, which was around the same time as HMS Dreadnought, that the first submarines capable of operations somewhere that wasn't just off your own front door started to be commissioned. Whilst these had almost all been superseded due to obsolescence by 1914, you might be forgiven for thinking that almost a decade was plenty of time to adapt, considering the changes that had been brought to tactics by the advent of the Dreadnought and the battlecruiser were well bedded in by this point. But you have to remember that those ships were an evolutionary development of older battleships and armoured cruisers, and therefore the tactics were similarly evolutionary. The submarine, on the other hand, was a revolutionary weapon without an immediate predecessor, and so a good portion of the intervening time had been spent working out just how to use them in the first place, since, of course, without knowing how a weapon is going to be used, it's relatively difficult to plan counter-tactics. As a result, some of these early ideas were, shall we say, somewhat endearing in their naivety. Without any real method to detect a submerged submarine, one leading idea for the time was to send out ship's boats when a periscope was spotted, and have an enterprising crewman attack the periscope with a hammer. This would, in theory, blind the submarine unless it surfaced for more honourable gun combat, at which point it would probably lose since, well, submarine versus actual surface warship. Other officers, whose primary experience of underwater targets clearly revolved around fishing, suggested explosive grapnel sweeps. These were adaptations of minesweeping gear, which was in some ways similar to certain kinds of long-line fishing, only for submarines. These turned out to actually work in combat on a few occasions. A similar concept to attach a float full of explosive to a cable and try and effectively lasso a spotted submarine with a TNT neck collar, which could then be remotely detonated, drew somewhat less praise, with one observer commenting that any submarine captain dumb enough to be sunk by such an attack rather deserved his fate. The somewhat more practical idea of actually shooting something at target also developed, with a variety of explosive devices that included hand-thrown bombs, actual sling-staff projectiles in a throwback to the medieval period, adapted field mortars, and the newly developing technology of aircraft bombs, with some of them using lines attached to floats as a form of manual depth setting, and the first experiments with depth charges also taking place around this time. Taking a theme from the explosive fishing line, it was also considered to try fitting a destroyer with a trawling net to ensnare a submarine as if it was a school of particularly heavily armed tuna, with the destroyer then coming around with a spar torpedo to finish off the ensnared submarine as if the destroyer was some kind of medieval knight with a lance. Luckily for almost everyone involved, except for the U-boat crews, a year before the war, Admiral Jellico, who was of course later to command the Grand Fleet at Jutland, came up with an idea. He asked the engineers to take an anti-shipping mine weighing half a ton, make it negatively buoyant, and then attach the newly invented hydrostatic pistol, a device that fired when a certain level of overpressure was reached. This created the first true depth charge as we would understand it, albeit that detonating a device that was designed to blow a significantly sized hole in the size of a battleship just after you chucked it off the back of your own ship, when the ship doing the chucking was usually quite a bit smaller than a battleship, turned out to be somewhat hazardous. In a more static role, large steel-reinforced nets derived from anti-torpedo nets were installed to protect harbours and anchorages at most major naval installations, and of course there was the good old-fashioned method of ramming, something for which older vessels in the various navies were unintentionally well placed to do, thanks to the prevalence of dedicated ram bows in ship design just prior to the First World War. Last but not least, there were minefields, which were absolutely deadly to submarines if they were caught in them, since the contact detonation of a mine on a submerged submarine would be almost guaranteed instant death, because, as mentioned before, these things were designed to put holes in ships that weighed tens of thousands of tons, so the effect on a submarine that weighed a few hundred tons was rather severe. This effect was of course mitigated by the fact that a mine was a relatively static device, and of course there was the increased complexity of interaction presented by the submarine operating in a 3D environment below the waves. Despite the rapid advances in submarine technology, the subs of the period of the start of the First World War were still quite limited in a number of ways, which rendered them vulnerable. The dive times were relatively short, owing to their relatively small size and the endurance of their batteries, as well as an often glacial underwater speed, which meant that, although they had underwater capability, they generally had to transit to or from operational areas on the surface for extended periods, as well as having to come up every so often to recharge the batteries. Additionally, torpedoes were a rare and valuable commodity on a submarine. Many of the early ones could only carry 3 or 4 torpedoes, and even by the 1910s, 6 to 8 torpedoes total was still typical. This would obviously increase during the war to somewhere just over a dozen on the latest and most capable designs, but for most submarines in World War I, relying on torpedoes to sink ships would result in few to any kills on a given patrol, since scoring a hit was of course by no means guaranteed and you had very few shots. This in turn meant that most submarines would reserve their torpedoes for military targets or especially large or fast merchant vessels, or maybe ones they'd already crippled, preferring instead to surface and sink submarines with their deck gun, for which far more ammunition could be carried, although again, shells were a limited quantity on a very small submarine. Of course, being on the surface made submarines much more easy to engage. This approach, however, was initially mandated by the international rules of war, specifically rules on commerce raiding, which called for a ship to be stopped, inspected, and then sunk only once the crew had been allowed to disembark, and then only if the ship was actually carrying materials useful to the war effort for the enemy country in question. This was epitomised early in the war by the U-boat U-9 sinking the old armoured cruisers HMS Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy in quick succession, albeit it did expend its entire torpedo stockpile in doing so. Now, whilst you can certainly raise moral issues with the torpedoing of ships engaging in the rescue of survivors, it was militarily a stunning success. In fact, for the German U-boat arm, it might have been too successful, as the catastrophic nature of the losses jolted the Royal Navy into a frantic scramble for new anti-submarine warfare tactics. Incidentally, during the attack, one particular Royal Navy crewman survived all 3 sinkings, as he managed to escape the first ship, reached the second, only for it to be torpedoed, and whilst in the process of boarding the third ship, it too was hit. In the end, he decided that a piece of driftwood was far safer, and after enlisting in the Royal Navy in the Second World War, he ended up living to a ripe old age of 90. So in theory, being repeatedly torpedoed can be good for your health, apparently. The fruits of these kick-started endeavours began to show in 1915, first in the deployment of a new range of depth charges. These were mercifully smaller than Jellicoe's Crushing Hand of God prototype, and whilst practically just as lethal to submarines, they were significantly less risky to the launching ship, and could also be carried in larger numbers. Given that a large number of the UK's best inventions tend to come from old men wearing flat caps whilst working in their sheds, the Admiralty also opened a board to look into suggestions submitted by members of the public. They got rather a lot of entries. Meanwhile, some relatively simple methods of anti-submarine warfare had been discovered. Due to the slow speed of submarines underwater, along with their limited range and, of course, the unguided straight-running nature of their torpedoes, warships could make themselves relatively safe from attack simply by sailing slightly faster and adopting a zigzag course, providing, of course, that the zigzag was not too predictable. For merchant ships, a variety of tactics were tried. Advice was given to merchant captains to turn towards a sighted submarine and try to ram it, which in theory would force the U-boat to submerge, and since even a merchantman could usually outrun a submerged submarine, once it was up to full speed, the merchantman would in theory then be able to escape. Additionally, some ships were armed, and others, especially trawlers, were given a Royal Navy submarine, which would follow on behind it. The idea being that a U-boat that surfaced could either be engaged by the unexpected guns on the ship, or, in the latter case, the British submarine, which presumably would not have been detected, could sneak up on the U-boat and sink it. The logical extension of this particular tactic was the Q ship. Since word of armed merchantmen would get around quickly, and U-boats would likely choose to expend precious torpedoes on them instead of surfacing, the Q ship involved even more guns fitted to chosen ships, which would then be deployed to the most heavily submarine-infested waters, with the guns hidden behind screens and other disguises. The idea being that when a submarine surfaced, thinking that it had found an easy and unarmed target, the disguise would be quickly dropped, and the sub then sunk fast enough that it couldn't give out any warning. Although initially quite effective, with one submarine even sunk by a small fishing smack armed with a single 47mm cannon, it didn't take too long for a U-boat to survive an encounter, and thereafter the effectiveness of Q-ships began to drop, in no small part due to the fact that it wasn't necessarily guaranteed that a Q-ship would win a gun duel with a submarine if the latter was on the alert. In the meantime, minefields would continue to reap a toll of submarines from all navies, at a steady, if somewhat surprisingly frequent, rate, largely down to the unexpected bonus of mines' mooring cables removing a lot of the 3D aspect of underwater travel, since these would snag on a passing sub and then drag the mine down into contact with the hull. This was somewhat assisted by the fact that most submarines, in all navies, ended up passing through some kind of narrow choke point, which was therefore easier to mine, such as the Dover Straits for U-boats, or the Dardanelles for the Royal Navy. Also in 1915 came the first and only confirmed sinking of a U-boat by a battleship, as HMS Dreadnought scored its only combat kill, using its ram bow to cut U-29 in half, fending off her half-sister HMS Temeraire in order to get at the hapless German. As 1916 rolled around, the various efforts that were being made were formalised into the Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Division, which, after some initial friction, gradually began to take over from the various previous units that had been set up with anti-submarine warfare in mind. Whilst in the United States, a naval board was already a year old and looking into the problem with some interest. Later, these two groups, along with their French Navy counterparts, would all contribute experts who would eventually begin research on what would eventually turn out to be ASDIC, or as the Americans would call it, sonar, albeit that this particular aspect of research would not be completed until after the First World War was over. Also during 1916 came the first successful attack on a submarine with depth charges when the Q-ship HMS Farnborough managed to destroy U-68 off the coast of Ireland. The increasing power and payload of aircraft also meant that anti-submarine patrols closer to the coastline could now be performed, albeit the relative inaccuracy of aerial bombardment, the relatively small size of bombs, and the still limited range of anything apart from a large airship meant that the most useful effects that these units had was not so much in sinking submarines, but in forcing them to submerge and go deep, which left a submarine slow and blind. A technique that would remain a key tool in the anti-submarine warfare arsenal until nearly the end of the Second World War. But it would be 1917 when things began to change in a major way. The foremost measure introduced in that year would be the convoy. This was not a particularly new idea. Convoys had been part of a life at sea for hundreds of years, and most major cargo movements in the Napoleonic Wars had been under convoy. However, the intervening century had seen the idea fall out of favour. The vastly increased speed of warships relative to cargo ships, as well as the greater range of guns, meant that it was thought that a surface raiding cruiser, or other capital unit, would simply be able to sink an entire convoy if it caught one, so there was no sense in bunching a load of targets together for easy pickings. On the other hand, the German High Seas Fleet was mostly contained, even in 1914, and by 1917 the only German vessels operating abroad, apart from a few armed merchant cruisers, were mostly contained in the area of the North Sea, and in the case of some U-boats, the Mediterranean. Further, the Admiralty had concluded that they now had enough escort ships to release sufficient numbers to convoy duty without imperiling the Grand Fleet. In truth, this had probably been the case to some extent since mid-1915, but, oh well, better late than never. Convoys would turn out to have a massive impact. Previous attempts to use escorts had seen them charge around the high seas looking for submarines as if they were hunting for surface raiders, and the general chaos of commercial shipping had meant that submarines could usually find some kind of target that wouldn't shoot back. With the final advent of convoys, it was as if the seas had suddenly cleared of targets, with vast tracts of ocean now having virtually no ships in them, and if a submarine found a convoy, it was heavily guarded and proceeding at a speed such that the submarine would probably get one shot at it if they were lucky. With the arrival of shipping, now vastly more predictable and concentrated, it also meant that aircraft patrols could now be used in specific guarding patrols instead of just general recon, which further aided in detecting and attacking U-boats, although not necessarily, as we mentioned earlier, destroying them. The result was that losses amongst merchant shipping plummeted, with many convoys making it through without any losses at all. That isn't to say there weren't downsides. Trying to keep merchants in line proved somewhat hard, and there were inefficiencies caused by merchantmen having to wait for a convoy to assemble, then travel at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy, and then perhaps also route via a non-optimal journey. Albeit that a ship that arrived a bit late was infinitely more valuable than a ship that was sunk whilst sticking to schedule. It wasn't a universal solution, however. Not every area of the world could or would adopt convoys, at least at first, and U-boats found they would naturally gravitate towards these somewhat easier convoy-free hunting grounds, which would push losses up at these locations, even as they dropped elsewhere. On the other hand, when U-boats were forced to go after convoys, the greater chances of meeting a warship meant that more of them would be sunk. In the middle of all this was also carefully targeted use of intelligence by Room 40, the Signal Interception and Decoding Division of the Royal Navy. See the video on them for more information. The fun wasn't over though. 1917 also saw the introduction of the rather wonderful Dazzle Camouflage, designed to confuse a submarine's captain when he was calculating the heading and speed of his target. Albeit that, whilst certainly confusing in many ways, its actual effectiveness would vary significantly depending on the sea conditions, the light conditions, and exactly what kind of Dazzle Camo scheme the ship in question was using. Also making a debut were magnetic indicator loops, a technology that still survives, in more mundane use, on today's roads. These cables used the interference created by the magnetic field of a submarine's hull to indicate the location of the vessel. For obvious reasons, they were only really useful at narrow choke points and to protect harbours, but they could be paired with command-detonated mines for a remarkably effective tripwire. Another helpful factor was the entry of the USA into the war, bringing with it a number of welcome additional destroyers, indeed almost the entire American destroyer fleet at the start, which would of course only increase in number over time as the Clemson swarm began its inexorable rise. This allowed more and better escorts and patrols to be formed. In the vast open oceans, sheer numbers are a tactic all of their own. Also seeing their launch in 1917 would be the world's first hunter-killer submarines. And yes, you did hear that right. But they don't have sonar, I hear you say. And they also don't have homing torpedoes. So how does this work? Well, those minor details didn't seem to trouble the Royal Navy, who were in the process of building the R-class submarines. These relatively small subs were optimised for underwater performance, had a significantly larger than average battery bank, no deck gun or any other external impediments if they could be avoided, and instead had an array of hydrophones in the bow along with 6 forward-facing torpedo tubes, each with 2 torpedoes. Although in practice it was found that they could stuff another 6 in by taking away some bunk beds. Now, yes, the idea of these subs was to charge around underwater, slowing down occasionally to listen for enemy submarines, ideally those on the surface, and then sneak up on them and torpedo them. A tactic that was only marginally better than running around blindfolded in a dark room with a knife and trying to stab people based on what you can hear. But with an underwater speed of 14 knots, they would be the fastest submarines in the world when submerged, all the way up until the late 1930s, albeit that they would turn out to be somewhat difficult to control when charging around at full power. In the end, they would come into service just a little too late to get any real success, although one of the class apparently did manage to detect, track, and attack a U-boat in 1918 using its hydrophones, but unfortunately, after carrying out a textbook full-salvo attack, the hit that it managed to score turned out to be a dud. 1918 primarily saw escalations and innovations in the swathe of new techniques introduced the previous year, as opposed to anything especially new. But along with the Americans, Japanese and Brazilian ships had arrived in combat theatres, which complemented the Imperial, American, French and Italian ships that were already hard at work. This all led to a spiral of increasing U-boat losses, in part due to simply the fact there were more escorts and they had better techniques and technology to deal with their targets, but also, as would also occur in World War II, in part because many of the most experienced captains and crews amongst the U-boat arm were lost in the latter half of the war, and less skilled replacements were of course easier pickings. In total, of the 360 U-boats that the Central Powers committed to action, 178, almost exactly half, were lost. The most successful anti-submarine technology turned out to be mines, with 58 confirmed kills.
Yay! I win, I win, I win!
Followed by depth charges, with 30 kills. I'm sure Jellico must have been pleased. Next, surprisingly, was torpedoes from other submarines, with 20 kills, with both the trawler following tactic and independent hunting having proved remarkably successful against submarines that still spent an awful lot of time on the surface. Ramming, the good old naval tradition that went back past the era of the trireme, accounted for another 19, with a similar number lost to unknown causes. The last 3 categories being accidents, with 7 victims, those explosive sweeps mentioned at the beginning, with 3, and other causes, including aerial bombing, accounting for 2. Set against this were Allied shipping losses of almost 13 million tons, including 10 battleships of various types, mostly pre-dreadnoughts, along with 18 cruisers, and quite a number of smaller craft, such as destroyers. with the top 3 U-boat commanders netting well over 1 million tons of shipping just between the 3 of them. So that wraps up this very brief summary of the evolution of anti-submarine warfare tactics in the First World War. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.